Thank you very much for coming to the ADA's and Asia Center's seminar today. We have, as I just said, we have more than 85 students and professors and experts log in to this seminar today. And also we have some students participate in person. Before I introduce today the speakers, I'd like to give you a little bit word about the host institute today's seminar. This seminar is co-hosted by Asia Center of Seoul National University and also Asia Development Institute, Graduate School of Public Administration, Seoul National University. Asia Center Seoul National University is one of the major research institute in Seoul National University, specialized in research in Asian region. And today, International Development Center in this institute is actually hosting the seminar. And International Development Center is very keen to outreach their research and also connect other research institutes in Asia. So this is a very good opportunity to interact with the University of Tokyo and also Institute of Advanced Studies on Asia, University of Tokyo. So that is the one research institute host to today's seminar. The other institute host this seminar is Asia Development Institute, Graduate School of Public Administration, Seoul National University. And this is a research institute specialized in development issues. So especially in the area of public policy and public administration. But the ADI is not confined their research topic in Asia. We are interested in development issues in other regions as well. So currently we are thinking, actually we are planning to change our name of institute so that research institutes will be Global Development Institute for Public Administration. So that will more correctly reflect that activities of research and other activities in the institute. Well, that's done, and I'd like to first thank today's speaker, Professor Sato Jin, and Professor Sato Jin will speak on the pivotal moments in Japanese ODA, circa 1950 to 1910. This is the today's topic, and this is really interesting topic for us because Korea is an emerging donor, maybe is now becoming one of the mature donors, and we are very interested in to learn about or know about the Japanese experience. And today's topic is really very useful for Korean audience as well as other international audience. Before I like to ask Professor Sato Jin to speak on this topic, I like to give you introduction to him. Professor Sato Jin is a professor at the Institute for Advanced Studies on Asia, Tokyo University, and he is the president of the Japan Society for International Development. So he is the leading figure in this field in Japan, and his research institutes include the politics of natural resource and foreign aid, particularly in the context of Southeast Asia. And Professor Jin Sato was appointed as a global scholar at Princeton University from the year 2017 to 2020 at the School of Public and International Affairs. And he is currently work as a visiting fellow of JICA Research Institute. He is also chief editor of International Journal of Asian Studies, published by Cambridge University. And he won the Japanese Academy Medal in 2014. So this shows that we have a very, very good speaker today. So without further ado, Professor Sato-jin, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. Professor Kwong, thank you very much for your kind introduction.
We can hear you well.
Yes, thank you so much for your kind introduction. I'm really honored to speak at Seoul National, very prestigious university in Asia. I'm also happy to talk to my Korean colleagues because our Japan Society for International Development, that I currently serve as the president, have a long-term relationship with KAIDEC, and so we have been exchanging visitors for a long time. So I'm really happy to sort of, after this Corona incidents, to reconnect with our colleagues in Korea. Let me move on to, let me see if I can show you my slides. Let's see. So as Professor Kwon mentioned, my talk today is on pivotal moments in Japanese ODA from around 1950 to 2010. Now, I just want to say a few words about what I mean by pivotal moments. So there are certain moments in the history of Japanese aid that really had the sort of a long-term impact to the way we provide aid. And I'm going to give you a very quick overview of what I consider to be the key sort of moments. And then in the second part, I will talk about what people call the controversial projects that Japan funded in the 1980s and 90s, and look at what happened to those controversial projects. So in the history of Japanese foreign aid, and I'm giving this talk because I am in the process of publishing a big book on the history of Japanese ODA. Unfortunately, this is in Japanese. So this is, my talk is more or less the summary of the basic arguments that I made. But there are certain questions that really lead us to investigate what are the pivotal moments. And there are certain questions that scholars have not sort of addressed squarely in the scholarship of Japanese aid. So for example, how exactly was reparation the origin of Japanese aid? In a lot of textbook of foreign aid, people say, war reparation was the origin of Japanese ODA, but there's not been a sort of a deeper examination to what extent or in what aspect reparation served as the origin. Second, how was Japan's aid able to expand so rapidly in the 1970s and 80s, and what was the implication from the recipient perspective? You know, we all know that Japanese aid grew rapidly in the 70s and 80s, and this is usually taken as given without much sort of investigation to what made this possible. So I will touch on this question as well. And thirdly, how was human conceived as an object of development assistance? Now, this may seem like a kind of a strange question, because people may think that, well, of course, development is about human and development is about people. But if you look at the history, we come to the conclusion that a lot of the ODA is triggered based on government-to-government agreement and not necessarily directed at people or individuals. So there's been a sort of a tension between a focus on human being as individual and human being as part of a group or part of a country. And I will touch on this debate around that happened in early 2000. And then in the second part of my talk, I will talk about I will address this question. What happened to controversial projects funded in the 1980s and 90s? As I will explain, there's been a lot of criticism about Japanese aid in the 80s and 90s. And I will give you some examples of what are the criticism made, especially by civil society and NGOs. The interesting thing is no one really followed up on what happened to those projects after the criticism. Not even the NGOs or the government. So the NGOs who criticized the project never followed up, and the government or scholars mostly forgot about those controversial projects. So I was lucky to sort of revisit those projects before the corona. I made a trip between 2016 and 2019 to revisit those controversial projects. And I'm going to share some of my findings from my trip. So this is just a quick sort of a summary of what the three pivotal moments, what I call pivotal moments. So in the 1950s, there was this establishment of cash return system in reparation schemes as the origin of grant aid or tied aid. So the way the cash flow is conducted is actually had the defining effect on the way Japan later on provided aid. And this system was established during the reparation period. So in this way, reparation was the origin. And I will talk a little bit more about this in the next slide. And the second pivotal moment is this from 70s to 80s. Is that there's a proactive use of what in Japan called the fiscal investment and loan program to expand loan budget, eventually inviting corruption in Southeast Asia. So there was a huge sort of a rapid increase of aid budget. But this was not the increase of the general budget from tax money, but they heavily relied on this program called FILP. Now, this is the money that is created based on the postal saving and pension saving, and Japanese aid. A lot of the big portion of Japanese aid is made up of loan. And because loan is something that you loan to someone, and then you're expected to sort of get the return, it was easier to sort of expand this aspect of ODA rather than grant or technical assistance, which has to rely on tax money. So this is one sort of a mechanism that allowed the expansion of aid budget in this period. And finally, on human-centered development. I would argue that there was an incomplete import of human-centered approach, which failed to transform Japanese aid from collective work ethic to a more individual-focused, human-centered aid. Okay, let's move on to a little bit more of detail. So the more I learn about the history of Japanese aid, the more I find the sort of how binding or how history influence the way we do aid. Now, for example, when people talk about, oh, Japanese aid started from war reparation, but the way Japan conducted war reparation was strongly influenced by the way the world concluded the first World War. So when the First World War ended, the winner countries forced the Germany to pay reparation in cash. Now, this damaged German economy and eventually invited Nazi forces to rise. And there was this lesson about this. And so after the Second World War was concluded and Japan was defeated, there was this kind of an agreement that the Allied powers should not request Japan to pay in cash because they don't want to repeat the mistake of the First World War. So from the beginning of the reparation, there was this definition of reparation under the American leadership, that Japan will pay reparation in goods and services, not in cash. Now, of course, Japan was totally devastated and there was not much cash to begin with, but this agreement was under the strong influence of the way First World War was concluded. And I think this is kind of important to remember. Now, in the more of a mechanism of foreign aid or reparation delivery, there was this kind of what we now call the request-based principle, and this became one of the key feature of Japanese aid. You know, we conduct aid based on request from the recipient country, so we don't force countries to accept our aid, but the request must come from the recipient aid. Now, how this started is we can sort of trace it back to the way reparation was conducted. So in those reparation days, each year, the countries, the recipient countries, seeking reparations will first make a list of the equipment and capital they wish to procure and consult with the Japanese side. So this is the first step. And the second step, when delegations of the claimants or the recipient countries do not know which companies to choose, they often seek recommendations from the Japanese government. So from the very beginning, there was already kind of, in a way, a fabrication of the request, right? So there was this kind of the under-the-table negotiation between Japanese companies and the Japanese government for what kind of goods and services that Japan can provide. So although it's in principle a request-based, the request is kind of fabricated, right? And this became kind of the model for the foundation of what later on we call tied aid, which will be criticized by a lot of recipient countries. Now, the second stage, and I'm moving quickly so that we have enough time for questions and comments. I'm jumping to 1970s and 80s when Japanese ODA budget increased dramatically, and as you can see in this graph. Now, the increase of Japanese ODA, in my view, was not necessarily the sort of an internal intention of the Japanese government. It was more in response to the pressure coming from the United States and DAC. DAC is the Development Assistance Committee in Paris, which is kind of the conglomerate of the Western forces in ODA. Japan was getting richer in the 70s and 80s, and there was a lot of cash inflow to Japan, and there was a lot of criticism that Japan should contribute more to the world. And so there was a lot of pressure, and Japan had to sort of respond to those pressure by increasing foreign aid. And also, something that we need to understand is at the same time, there was an appreciation of Japanese yen. So the value of Japanese yen was increasing dramatically. Up to early I forgot the exact year, but up to 1960s, $1 was 360 yen, and later on it became stronger and stronger, and in the 1980s it became almost like $1 of 80 yen. So the value of Japanese yen has also increased, which means that if you borrow money from Japan, then it will expand, and then now Japan can do a lot by using the same amount of budget. So this is another aspect of expanding Japanese influence through aid. And then again, there was this mobilization of fiscal investment and loan program, which I touched on later. Now, because it's loan, Japan was able to do a big project, right? If it's grant or technical assistance, the range of stuff that we can do, that Japan can do is limited. But because it's loan, Japan could offer to build roads or dams, you know, all the big projects, which later on invited criticism by NGOs by not paying attention to human rights or people who are forced to evict and things like that. But this sort of rapid expansion went together with Japanese emphasis on infrastructure, which characterize Japanese style, particularly in comparison to the Western aid, where there's a lot of emphasis on poverty reduction, human rights, environment, so on and so forth. And stage 3, there was kind of a discovery of human in development assistance. Now, of course, in the international community, UNDP published a Human Development Report in 1990. There was this influential figure like Amartya Sen, who was coming into the debate about, why are we doing development? Development is for people's freedom. There's a lot of sort of transformation of development aid more toward human. And in the context of Japanese aid provision, the symbolic incidence was the Madame Ogata Sadako's presidency in JICA from 2003. Now, I'm not quite sure how Madame Ogata is known in the Korean community, but she's a very famous international figure. She was serving as the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, for a long time. And because she had a background in refugee issues, her focus was more on people than government. In fact, she was more against the government, who was kind of oppressing the people. Now, when she became the president of JICA, she wanted to transform JICA more towards refugee issues or poverty issue or people-oriented issue. And later on, this will be labeled as human security issues, not national security, but human security, right? Now, but of course, ODA was still conducted under the assumption of the government-to-government agreement. So there's always a limitation that, of course, the government don't want to assist the people if you're working with people who are against the government, right? So there's always a sort of the outer limit of the G2G agreement. But Madame Ogata tried to sort of push the limit more towards human orientation. And of course, at that time, there was a lot of criticism to Japanese aid that there was not much of a philosophy of foreign aid or the principle. And around that time, there was this a focus on the support for self-help efforts. And this is another sort of an interesting sort of an emergence of why we are emphasizing self-help efforts. And this self-help efforts is kind of a rhetoric that matched very well with the Japanese aid, because Japan's aid relied heavily on loan, right? And in order to repay loan, you have to help yourself. And then the logic of the Japanese aid provider was loan is good because it really forces the recipient to work towards creating money to repay. So this really matched the Japanese style of ODA. But my question is, who is the subject of the self-effort? Now, this is totally different from what Madame Ogata had in mind. So in Ogata's mind, the self-help effort should focus on people, and the Japanese aid should focus on human security. But in fact, the assumption of loan providers, especially the OECF, which is the money provider in the Japanese ODA, the assumption was that the subject of self-help is government. The government should make an effort to repay the money, right? So there's kind of a slight gap in who is supposed to sort of help themselves. And I would argue that Japan has the sort of a long time culture of working as a group. There's a collective work ethic, which is really difficult to sort of escape from. And so I would say that although there was an effort to import this human-oriented development to Japan, I would say it was very incomplete. Although Madame Ogata made a huge effort to do that, I would say it was incomplete, largely to do with one cultural issue of the way Japanese do projects on the ground as group. And second, the broader scheme of ODA was based on government-to-government agreement, right? Not people-to-people agreement or government-to-people agreement. Therefore, it was really difficult to sort of penetrate into this deep into people despite the amazing leadership by Madame Ogata. Now, okay, let's move on.